Okay, so in the video you just watched, you learned about the different types of three-dimensional figures: prisms, pyramids, cones, cylinders, and then the sphere, but the sphere doesn't have anything to do with this video, so I'm not going to bring it over. So you learned mainly about what edges and faces are. Okay, edges being any flat surface, okay, or excuse me, faces being any flat surface, or like I like to say, any two-dimensional shape. So this hexagon's a two-dimensional shape, this hexagon, all of these rectangles, those are two-dimensional shapes, so they're faces. Squares and triangles, okay, circles, that kind of a thing. Those are your faces, and then of course your edges are where the faces connect. I like to say any line segment. So if I was drawing this hexagonal prism, every line segment, I would draw 6 line segments to draw this hexagon, 6 here, and then 6 to connect. So that would give me all my edges. Those faces and edges are split into certain types, and that's where this part of the vocabulary comes in. So on your vocabulary sheet, you should say that underneath faces, it says lateral faces, and underneath edges, it says lateral edges, and that's mainly what we're going to talk about here. So let's start with face. A face is any two-dimensional shape or flat surface that I see on my three-dimensional figure. So here I have triangle, and then 3 rectangles. Okay, you have 2 types of faces. The first are your base shapes. Okay, so 2 of my faces here are the triangles, which are the base shapes of my three-dimensional figures. Here, my base shapes are hexagons, which are 2 of my faces. Here, my base shapes are circles, which are my base, is the only 2 faces it has. Here, my base shape is a square. So the first part of your faces is the ones that are your base shapes. Okay, the second are called the lateral faces, and the lateral faces are all the other ones that aren't your bases. Okay, so if the triangles are my bases, these 3 rectangles are my lateral faces. Okay, the way I describe it is, okay, if I have a triangle, which is my base shape, right now that's two-dimensional, okay, and I have another triangle over here, which is two-dimensional. What makes something three-dimensional is when we go ahead and connect those two-dimensional shapes. So those are my bases. So when I go to connect them, the 3 rectangles are formed. Those are my lateral faces. So the lateral faces are what are formed when you take your 2 dimensionals and you make them 3-dimensional by connecting them. Okay, that's what's formed. So with a pyramid, my base shape is a square, so all of these are my lateral faces. So instead of connecting 2 shapes, okay, with a pyramid, I have my base shape, which is a face, and then I have my vertex, 2-dimensional. When I go to connect, that's what makes things 3-dimensional. That's when all of these triangles are formed. Okay, those are my lateral faces. Now, something to note. Base shape is a hexagon, my lateral faces are rectangles. Base shape is a triangle, my lateral faces are rectangles. Write this down. All prisms have lateral faces that are rectangles. If it is a prism, the lateral face, the in-between, will always be rectangles. Okay, you can see that with these 2. If it is, so it doesn't matter what the base shape is, that can be anything, the lateral faces are rectangles. Pyramids, I only have 1 here, but it doesn't matter what the base shape is. This base shape is a square, I could have a triangular pyramid, I could have a pentagonal pyramid, that doesn't matter. Your lateral faces are always triangles when you have a pyramid. Okay, now let's move to the cylinder. I have the 2 base shapes, which are 2 faces. A cylinder doesn't have any 2-dimensional shapes here. So a cylinder has no lateral faces. It has the 2 base shapes, but 0 lateral faces. We just call this a lateral surface. Okay, a cone is the same thing. It only has 1 face, and that is the base shape. A cone has no lateral faces. It just has a lateral surface as well. And of course, the sphere has no faces at all, so it doesn't have any lateral. Then, lateral edges. Well, they're the edges of your lateral faces. Okay, so again, if we talk about how I drew this base triangle and I drew that base triangle, my lateral edges are the ones that I draw to connect them together. They're the ones that make it three-dimensional. They're the connecting edges, okay? So with my pyramid here, my lateral edges are the ones that I use to connect from my base shape to the vertex. That's what makes the lateral edges, okay? Your base edges are the side lengths of your bases. So these three edges that I drew to draw the triangle and these three edges that I drew for the triangle, those are my base edges. They're the edges of the base. Okay, it's again, mathematicians, not creative. This is what we're talking about. And so here, these three are base edges, these three are base edges, these three connecting the two triangles are lateral edges. Hexagonal prism. These six are base edges because it makes my base. This six are base edges because it makes a base. The six that connect them are the lateral edges. Pyramid. These four are base edges because it makes my base shape. The four that connect it up to the vertex, those are my lateral edges. We talked about how these figures don't have edges at all. So because they don't have any edges, they also don't have lateral edges. Okay, so that's really what this boils down to. The last video kind of talked about what edges and faces and three-dimensional figures are. Now we're going to talk specifically about the types of edges and the types of faces. So those lateral edges versus base edges, and then those lateral faces versus base shapes that are faces.